is a review of MLA formatting for papers. This lecture will have basically 3 parts. So as you see on the screen, we will first discuss the first page with a header and the formatting for the top page. We will discuss MLA formatting for in-text citations, so stuff in the middle, and then we will end at the end of the paper with the works cited page. So we'll kind of work our way through a fictional paper, if you will. So what we have before us is the first page of a properly formatted MLA paper. You'll notice that everything is numbered, so we'll go through the numbers. And number 1 starts with your name as the student. So this paper was written by Joe Student. Immediately following your name is your instructor, professor, teacher's name. This helps not only them, but it helps you to keep track of papers. That has happened occasionally where papers get submitted incorrectly, especially if there is no sort of header or organizing information on the top. So it helps you stay organized as well. And then also following that as well is the course title. If that's ENG-105, 106, if it's Composition 1, English 105, English 106, whatever that may be, whatever designation this course has follows the instructor's name. And then the last thing up in the corner is the day that this paper is submitted. So you'll have a different date there than you for your rough draft than you do for your final paper. Once again, this also helps you keep control or organization of your drafts, because it also has happened where students turn in a very, very rough draft or a second draft with comments still from a peer reviewer in the margins. And so you always just put the date that the paper is due. So that date, like I said, will change. When we have an in-class workshop, you'll put that day's date there. And then when you finally turn the paper in, the day it is due, so it'll be a Friday or whatever day, will go in that corner. And notice how that is day, month, year. That is how MLA formats. Other citations use different formatting, but it's always day, month, year, not just for your header, but also for your works cited publication dates as well. So keep that in mind, day, month, year. Then you'll notice centered in the middle of the page is a header. It is catchy, but it is also informative. Frustration at the airport is intriguing. A problem occurs at an airport, and you want to keep reading. So we always make sure our headers are informative and relate to our paper, but also can be eye-catching and entertaining. Now, the 6th that is kind of floating there back in between the header and the title is floating there for a reason, because every paragraph starts with an indentation. With how formatting works in Word or Google Docs or Microsoft, whatever you're using, sometimes that first initial paragraph indent is forgotten. So we want to make sure that we indent our first paragraph, but then all of our subsequent paragraphs afterwards. Now moving over to the 7 on the right-hand side, that is indicating that we always use double spacing. Keep in mind, sometimes documents default tend to add spacing beyond the double spacing. So they'll double space it, but they'll also add an extra 6 points or 12 points before or after a line. So that can add extra spacing in between paragraphs. That can add extra spacing in between the header and the main text. It can also add extra spacing in between the lines themselves. So we want to make sure that we've reset the paper. Everything is simply double spaced. There's no additional spacing added in between the lines or after paragraphs, so that you'll have a very nice uniform look with the double spacing. Now the 8 that is also floating there over on the right-hand side is there to indicate that we want 1-inch margins all the way around, top, bottom, left, right, just simply 1-inch margins. And then lastly, we also have a page number entered on the top, but you also see Joe's student's last name is next to that page number. So you'll always put whether, it's Dickett, Smith, Lopez, whatever it might be, in the top right-hand corner with the page number. And you'll have page numbers in every single one of your pages of your paper. So from page 1 all the way to the works cited, you will keep the page numbers intact with your last name there. So when you submit a final paper, this is exactly what the top portion, the header of that paper should look like. Now, next, it is more likely than not that you will be using some sort of summary, paraphrasing, quotes, some sort of text that is not your own. And we always need to make sure we are indicating text that is not our own. So there are a few ways we can do that, 2 major ways we can do that at MLA. And we can typically do this through a signal phrase, and then we give our quote or our summary or our paraphrase, and then we explain it afterwards. So you'll notice that I have a paragraph here where I talk about an idea about communal intellectual property, but then we reach a quote from a text, Bullock and Goggin, and it's clearly indicated with quotation marks, so our quote is in quotation marks, and I've provided the exact text word for word, no changes, and then I have an end quote. And look, there's no punctuation, no ending of that quotation besides that end quote, because then in parentheses, I put the author's name and page number. So if there's just one author, it would just be Bullock 526. And you can see here I have 2, so it's Bullock and Goggin 526. And then that's where the period comes in after the parentheses with the information. That is to show that this is a whole unit, because sometimes you'll use a lot of quotes back to back, and we want to make sure that we are indicating what quote comes from where clearly. So our quotation marks and our punctuation really help emphasize that. And then I follow that quotation with an explanation of why this particular quote. There's a lot of information out there. This is a very large book. There's over 500 pages. Why did I choose this particular quote? So I explained that after following my quote. The other thing that you need to know is that, and you can see below, I kind of break it down almost into a formula. You'll see the signal phrase, the quotation mark, the exact text. You go right into an end quotation mark with no extra punctuation. We have a parentheses with the author's last names and page numbers, end parentheses, and then punctuation. And we follow this by an explanation. The other thing you need to know is, as you can see from this paragraph, I don't actually use the author's name or the text name in my signal phrase. That is, it's sometimes very clunky to say, I'd have to use both authors, first and last name. So, Bullock and Goggin, I don't know their first names off the top of my head, in their text, the Norton Field Guide for Reading and Writing, talk about, and then I introduce the quote. It gets very clunky and doesn't really do a good job of signaling how their quote or their idea relates back to my idea. So consider not using the names and the text in the sentence, unless it's like the only text you're talking about. If we're only using one text and we're analyzing that text in a lot of detail, usually in the first paragraph of your paper, you'll need to introduce that text, the author, and the text that it comes from. So, but then once you do that, you don't use the author's full name, you just use the last name, Bullock and Goggin, to reference them. So there are a few more smaller details to keep in mind when using the more I guess, using a more nuanced way of writing with MLA. But the biggest thing is when you're using direct quotes or even paraphrases of ideas that are not your own. So I would be saying Bullock and Goggin talk about crediting other authors. Those are my words, but originally it was their idea. I would still need to cite them with that same formatting. So keep in mind the quotation mark, signal phrase, the use of quotations for a direct quote, or if you use a paraphrase, you don't need the direct quotes, but you still need to cite both of those. And then you need to cite in the manner shown on the screen. So when you use citations in a paper, you need to make sure that you include those on a works cited page. Now, you'll notice the works cited page actually comes on its own page. It starts at the top of the page. There's still that last name and page number in the corner. And then you'll notice I have 5 different sources, and they are all listed alphabetically by last name. So we have Bailey, Bullock, Lamott, plagiarism, and then Soon. You'll notice that plagiarism is not a last name, but we don't actually have an author for that source, and so we list, depending on what information we have for that source, changes how we list that. But we'll start back up at the top. So our first source, Jonathan Bailey, is a news article just from a popular source website. You might use these for a newspaper article that you're quoting if you're using that as a source. You might use an academic website. I quote things from Harvard and Excelsior Online Writing Lab and Purdue OWL. There's a lot of actually very reputable academic sources where they're posting articles for general public to read. So, but this is not a lecture about checking the reliability of sources. This is just how we cite them. So we have the author's last name, comma, first name with a period. That's our first unit. Then we have quotation marks for smaller sources. So this is just an article on a website. So the article itself goes in quotation marks, and you'll notice a period after the article title. And then we go right into where that article is found. What container? Who contains it? Well, it's contained on a website called Plagiarism Today. And so since that's the bigger source, that actually goes in italics. And you'll notice that for every single citation on this works cited, the smaller source goes in quotation marks. A larger source where something might be contained will go in italics. And then after that, we put a comma and we have 21 Mar for March 2019. We have our date in day, month, year form, and we have our month abbreviated. And that's followed by a comma with the hyperlink. And followed by a period to end out that unit or that overall container, if you will. So the new MLA made a lot of changes. There used to be a lot more information you had to include with even just a simple article on a website. But for this, because we also include a hyperlink now, we don't need a lot of the information we used to when the sources were in print, because if you give a date that you access it on and the link where you access it, it's very easy for your readers to go back and check your sources and check your original quotes and see what you read. So this unit is how we would cite any article on a website. Pretty great, pretty basic compared to what we used to have to include. So the next source then is the one we used previously with the in-text citation example. And this is a book with 2 authors. So you'll notice right away that once again we have Bullock, comma, Richard. But then we have and Maureen Daly Goggin. That is because we have Bullock, the last name of Richard, to help us alphabetize. And then we always then list a second author, just first name, middle, last, or first, last. Once again, notice a period to kind of encapsulate that amount. And then we go into the source. Now, for this, I'm just citing the whole book. And so that's why this source is in italics. Now, had I been just quoting a chapter from this book, I would put the chapter in quotation marks, plagiarism in the writing class, say, for example. That would go in quotation marks, followed by the italic name of the big book. So once again, we still have that small container, larger container structure. Once again, we have a period to end that title. And then we list the publisher and the year it's been published. So publisher, comma, year, period. Once again, this is different than previous MLA. We used to have to include a city, sometimes city, state for the publisher as well. But a lot of that with the new MLA was made redundant, especially now because you can access all that pertinent information online. You can see where a publisher comes from, find exact copies of books. It's a quick Google search. So a lot of times, with the new MLA update, they made a lot of that information not necessary. Our third source by Anne Lamott is kind of what we just talked about, is a chapter from a book. But this book is unique because it is a collection of essays and critical articles by other authors. So we actually credit the original author from this book. It's not a edition, or it's not just a collection of readings. In the first example of a book, the Norton Field Guide was written by those two authors. This next book, Language Awareness, Reading for College Writers, is just a collection of readings for college writers. So we credit the author of that reading I'm quoting. So I'm quoting Shitty First Drafts. So Anne Lamott, who wrote that, her name is what comes first. So once again, same structure, last name, comma, first name, period. We have the smaller container, smaller work in quotation marks. We have the larger work contained in italics. But since this is an edited collection, we have a comma, and then we say it's edited by, and we list the names of our editors. This then is followed by the publisher, once again, like above, with W.W. Norton and Company. This time it's Bedford St. Martin's. We have a comma, and we list the year. But then here's also the last important part. Because it's only one critical article written by this author, and she hasn't written the whole book, we need to cite the page range that her source comes from. So we have the PP period because it's a page range. If it was just a single page, you'd have 1P. And then we have our page range from this text. The reason this is important is because it then helps your reader go directly to the page where this article is found. So it's less difficult for them to find this original source that you've been using. So a little more information, because this is an article, it's a reading collected in a book and edited by a number of people. So we need to kind of give credit where credit is due to all of the people involved in this process. So we do include a little more information than the previous example of a book, but it's very important information. So our fourth example is another website, page on a web page. But you'll notice that we don't actually have an author for this. So there's two approaches we can use in MLA depending on what information we have. And for this, what we have is the page on a website. So we just list that first because we do not have an author. But we do have a sponsor, an overarching sponsor, if you will, which is the University of Oxford. So we list that in italics as the larger source where this is contained, and then we follow that with the hyperlink. That simple. We do not need access dates. They can be included if a page is constantly changing, but all you need for a source that doesn't have a author or a publication date is the title of that page, where that page is contained, aka the larger sponsor, and then the page link. Very, very simple compared to previous MLA. However, we can't end on a simple example, so we've saved the most complicated of our examples for last, and that is the academic journal. The reason why this is complicated is because there's a number of layers of where these sources are contained. So way back in the day, sometimes some of these journals are 100 or 200 years old. So way back before the internet was around, these journals were published physically, and much like, a newspaper, but they were published quarterly or annually, and they got delivered to a library or a university, and that was the only way you could access these, was through those sources. So it's really great that our gatekeeping has shifted. A lot of these are public access, or your school subscribes to where these are now housed. But why I provide that history is I like to think of these journals as how they used to be in the days of old, because that helps me understand why I need so much information. So let's get into the citation of a academic journal article. So once again, last name, comma, first name, always for authors, the first author or only author, we list it that way. And then we have the title of our article, which is Citation Problems of Chinese Master's Theses and Pedagogical Implications. And once again, we end that with a period, and that's it's the next unit, if you will, self-contained unit. Now, where is this smaller individual article contained? Well, it is in the Journal of Asia TEFL, which is Teaching English as a Foreign Language. So that comes in italics. However, this journal is published multiple times a year. So if you just put the Journal of Asia TEFL, it would be very unclear where to access this. And now once again, think these are still published in print. So think that your reader does not have access to the internet for some reason, and you tell them to go look at the Journal of Asia TEFL, and they're sitting here with 12 journals because this is a monthly journal, or they're sitting here with 4 very large journals because it's published quarterly, or it's published annually, but it's 10,000 pages long, which also happens. So we need to include the volume and the issue number to narrow down exactly which Journal of Asia TEFL you are referencing. Because like I said, some of these journals, you'll see you're in volume 1088. This is a publication that they publish 4 times a year. They've been doing it for, almost 100 years. And so, or almost 50 years. And so the volume number and the issue number let your reader know exactly which journal to pull. And think of journals like a lot of them literally look like books. So whether it's softcover or hardcover, these journals just look like books. So we need to make sure we include volume number, issue number. Those are 2 separate numbers. And then include, they'll usually give you like a spring or winter, maybe they'll say March, or sometimes they won't, and it'll just be a year. It'll just be 2008. So you include the year as well. And then the page range of the journal. Because once again, some of these journals are 1,000, 5,000 pages long, especially if it's only published annually or biannually, so twice a year. So we need to make sure to include that page range as well. However, because I'm assuming you're not going to the library and pulling one of these dusty old journals from, the 1980s or the early 2000s from hand, you need to also include the largest container, or what digital platform you are accessing this journal and this article from this journal. So in this case, this would be ProQuest, which is in italics because it's one of those big, large containers. And that's followed by a comma and the stable URL. You can also use the DOI as well. Some journals only have a DOI or any sort of stable URL, because then your reader can just copy and paste and go directly to that source. The reason why, once again, we provide both materials is because some actually still access these journals in print and some access these online. But you can kind of see the levels of containers with these academic sources, which makes it very difficult. You'll see it's probably our longest source on the page. However, all this information is very important. And so we go from the author and our smallest container, aka the article the author wrote, to the journal where that article is housed or contained, to the vast online library, if you will, online platform where that whole journal is also contained. So that's the new MLA likes to reference things in terms of containers. And I think that makes a lot of sense because we have a smaller container or the words on the page that we're using, but that's typically from a bigger journal of like-minded articles, in this case, teaching English as a foreign language in Asia. And then all of those articles in that journal are found on an online platform. So we need each level, each container in our citation of a academic journal.